Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chafes, volume 29, the first Sicha for Brashevitzky Teitzei. This Sicha will explain the essence of the prohibition of mixing certain types of items or certain things, such as, first of all, in garments, wool and linen. That's a prohibition. Also mixing various animals or even working with them together, and likewise mixing various types of seeds, types of plants. And also the similarity of all of this to another type of forbidden mixture, namely basar b'cholov, mixing meat and milk. As an introduction, so we are better familiar with some of the concepts that are mentioned throughout the Sikha. So there are three types of kilayim, meaning forbidden mixtures. And going forward, we're just going to refer to it as kilayim. Number one, in agriculture, that you're not allowed to mix two types of species. And the classical example given in the Torah is you're not allowed to mix the vine with grain, the kerem with the chita. In animals, you're not allowed to work with two different types of animals. For example, it says, L'sachrish b'shor v'chamor yachtov. You're not allowed to plow with an ox and a donkey together. And also, of course, you're not allowed to mate two different animals to create a new species. And then in garments, as we mentioned, Leisil b'shatnis, as it mentions in our parsha, you're not allowed to combine wool and linen to create a cloth from which to make a garment. Another type of mixture, which, as we said in the introduction, we're going to talk about, so I want to be familiar with it. It's worthwhile to understand that basar b'cholov, meat and milk. The prohibition min haTorah, the actual biblical prohibition, is only when you cook it. When you cook it, it becomes fused together. It becomes like one. Either by means that they actually kind of both break down and they become all one kind of one entity, or even if they both remain intact in their original appearance, so to speak, but still the fact that they cook together because of the heat and so on, that makes it that each one absorbs flavor from the other, thus becoming like one. Another thing to be familiar with is the idea that whenever we have a suggestive thought, a suggestion, or an initial, as we call a kosalka daitoch, something that kind of goes up on one's mind, someone that can think or suggest something, and then we look for and we find a pasuk, a verse, or a very strong source to negate it and say, no, it's not that way, that in itself is evidence that the initial way of thinking, that the suggestive way of thinking does have validity according to the Torah. Because otherwise, why would the Torah go out of its way to negate something that has no Torah rationale? Finally, the attributes chesed and gevura, as they are holy attributes, they represent two different things. Chesed, kindness, is, as it means, givingness without a limit. Also, in a great expression of it is Ava, love, in this case, love of Hashem. Gvura is restraint, right, which is the lack of giving, the opposite. What is it also, how does it express itself? In a manner of yiras Hashem, the fear of Hashem. Let's go into the Sikha. So in our Parsha, chapter 22, beginning in verse 11, it says that right after it says first the prohibition of leisil b'shatnis tzemer afishten yachtov, that you should not wear clothing made of wool and linen together. And the next pasuk in verse 12 it says gedilim tasalach al arba kanfes kesuscha, that you should make strings, you should make tzitzis on the four corners of your garments. From this we learn out, since the juxtapose, why would the Torah put it together in one continuance? That tells us, says the halacha, that kilayim is permitted in tzitzis. That yes, if you have shatnez and that's the only tzitzis you can wear, you're allowed to wear it. Likewise, we find this heter of, in fact, it's not just a heter, it's an obligation, also by another matter of mitzvah or kedusha, holiness, and that is the big day kahuna. The garments of the kohanim, whether the kohen gadol or the regular kohanim, where the four garments had a sash, the avneit. Now the sash was actually made of shatnez, and they were not only allowed to wear it, but they had to wear it. If a kohen was not to wear it and do the avodah would be rendered pasul. So the question is, on the one hand, we find that generally speaking, there's a very strong correlation between the three types of kilayim. The fact is that the Torah lists them together. If you go back to verse 9, 10, 11, the Torah mentions them all together. And even though on the one hand they're all likened to one another, they're all in the same general category, they're all of the same general idea, but yet the only one that has the exception, the only one that is permitted in some instances, or as we said, not only permitted, but perhaps even it's an obligation, is only the one that relates to kilayim of the garment. That's one matter that we need to address. Also, there is something that is very similar to the idea of kilayim, and that is, as we mentioned in the introduction, basar v'chalav. In fact, in many of the Kabbalistic Sfarim, actually brings that the Isur, the prohibition of basar v'chalav, is kisoid kilayim, like the same of the same secret, of the same nature of esoterics as kilayim. As we said, they have a very strong similarity. Now we do find something interesting. In the Mechilta, that's one of the Midrashim, we find that there is a kosalka daitach. There is a suggestion that perhaps when it comes to basar v'chalav, it should be permitted in holy matters. Let's say when it comes to matters of karbanis and things like that, it shouldn't effectively be prohibited. And therefore, says the Medrash, we darshan the pasuk, going back to Chumash Shmos, if you looked in chapter 23, verse 19, it says over there, Reishis bikuri ad mascha tavi beis Hashem elekecha, the truma from the fruits, right, the very first of your fruits, you should bring to the house of God, to the house of Hashem your God, but you should not cook the gedi in its mother's milk. So what do you see over there? If you take the words Beis Hashem Elekecha, that even in, quote, the house of Hashem your God, says the Medrash, we still say Lo Yisavashel K'di B'Chalei V'Imoi, Basar V'Chalav is forbidden. So if you want to break it down, it's as following. When it comes to the kilayim of begadim, of garments, that is wool and linen, the Torah makes it permitted, and in some cases, like I said in the Bigdei Kahuna, it's not only permitted, it's obligated when it comes to matters of holiness or mitzvah, like tzitzis. When it comes to basar v'chalav, at the end of the day, it's forbidden, but there is at least a suggestion, and like I said in the introduction, a suggestion according to Torah that it should be permitted. But however, when it comes to the kilayim of animals or agriculture, there's not even a suggestion that it should be permitted. There it's absolutely forbidden, even when pertaining to matters of holiness or of mitzvah. And the question is, since, like we said before, all these kilayim do have something in common, including basar v'chalav, meat and milk, the mixture of meat and milk, why is it that we have this distinction, this contrast between them and these three groups? So the Rebbe says we'll understand this based on what the Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman, explains in the matter of shatnez, of mixing, of the prohibition of mixing wool and linen. That this is exclusively in regard to the mitzvah, the prohibition of mixing wool and linen. Only in this particular type of kilayim, there is scorn from the nations of the world, from the non-Jews. However, this is not the case when it comes to kilayim of, like we said, animals, the prohibition of mixing various animals, mating different animals, or agricultural kilayim. And he explains why. Why this distinction? So he explains because really the prohibition of mixing wool and linen is something which is of concealed, a hidden reason. In other words, there's no real reason that the human mind can wrap around. It doesn't make sense. Whereas when it pertains to kilayim of animals or agriculture, this is something which is understandable, and therefore even the goyim can relate to it and accept it, if only they're objective. What is it? He says that Hashem created the world in such a manner, He made the creation in such a manner that He embedded in each and every one of His creations this power of procreation to make everything continue. Hashem intended that everything, every species, every kind, everything continues to procreate. So that, in other words, that they remain and maintain its kind. And therefore, when you start mixing various animals or seeds, what do you do by this? You're actually ruining the course that Hashem set in place, set in motion. You're mixing, you're weaving together, and therefore tampering, so to speak, with creation. You're changing things as Hashem wanted them to be. Now, the idea, by the way, that the Torah prohibits also even to work them together also is an extension of this. It makes sense. Because if they're always going to be working together and being in the same vicinity, that's going to lead to them mating together. So it's almost effectively as if you're making them mate together. So a goy could understand that. But when it comes to mixing wool and linen, which is already a finished product, that the goy doesn't understand. This is something which, like he says, is a tam ne'elam. It's a concealed reason for it. It's something more heavenly, more Kabbalistically. So we see from this that there's a fundamental difference in the various kilayim. When it comes to, I'm just summarizing, when it comes to agriculture or animals, mixing them together, you're tampering with something fundamental, with their actual existence. You're trying to change, you're trying to create a new existence, you're trying to change them around. But when it comes to, when it relates to the kilayim of garments, that's already like almost like a superficial tampering. Because even after you connect the two, even when you weave it together, they're still essentially two separate things. You didn't blend them, you didn't melt them together, you just wove them together. Technically speaking, you can separate it by pulling every thread out of that weaving, and they will be back to linen and wool, two separate entities. So that's the distinction between the two. Now let's look at Basar B'Chalav. Basar B'Chalav seems to be almost like an intermediary between these two categories. Because from the Torah, what is the prohibition? The prohibition is only if you really fuse them together by means of cooking it, that they become almost like one entity. But still, in the one hand, yes, they're fusing them together and they're becoming like one entity, a new entity, but at the same time, you're not tampering with their actual existence. You didn't change it. You didn't take the milk and stop it from being milk. You didn't take the meat and stop it from being meat. Furthermore, you did not in any way hinder their ability, so to speak, to procreate. That's not the issue here. So it's kind of like in between the kilayim of the garments of material and the kilayim of animals and agriculture. Now, the Rabbeinu Bechai explains something very interesting. That when we say that there's a mixture here that is forbidden, it's not just a material mixture. It's not just blending of two different things in the Gashmistic sense, but rather when we blend these two different things and bring them together, we're actually making a whole mix-up, so to speak, in a spiritual manner. And the expression he uses is ma'arve v'koiches elyonim. You're taking the upper power, so to speak, and mixing them together and making a fusion of two opposite extremes, which leads to no good. And likewise, when it comes to meat, mixing basar b'chalav, meat and milk, they represent, or they correspond to, two opposite levels, which by mixing them together, you're now creating almost a confusion, because you're making the fusion that's making a confusion. And therefore, it's not really a good thing. It's like mixing, so to speak, chesed and gevura. Basar b'chalav is chesed and gevura, and the same thing as a kilayim. You are mixing two opposites, which are not meant to be the same. Each one has its own identity, its own expression, and by you mixing it together, this doesn't lead to good results. That's what Rabbi Bechai explains. Now, based on the distinction we made between above, according to the Ramban, between the animal / agriculture versus the kilayim of garments, we can understand also in this matter that the spiritual powers that are being mixed up over here, also there's a difference between these two categories. In other words, there's a distinction. And we can explain it according to the following manner. In other words, we'll explain it according to the following explanation. Bear with me for a moment. Here is a question that could be asked. Remember, the Rabbeinu Bechai says that this is no good when you mix things together. It becomes all convoluted, and it's actually not good and it's dangerous. That's why we shouldn't do it. Question: isn't the ultimate ideal in the whole of Torah, in the whole of Yiddishkeit, to bring peace and harmony? That means to bring things together. This is the greatest thing that there could be. And to the extent that it's explained that spiritually, what sets the midos apart, the emotional attributes, when it comes to kedusha, when it comes to holiness, they come together. They actually can complement each other. Take, for example, chesed and gvura. Ordinarily, they're two opposite things. But when functioning in the realm of kedusha, the realm of holiness, they actually complement each other. To the extent that it's explained that normally one who has ava cannot have yira. One who has the love cannot have fear, because love brings you closer, fear brings you distant. One who has yira cannot have ava. But in Yiddishkeit we know that the same person can have both, not only could have, but should have both ava and yira, and they complement each other. So the question is, why over here are we making such a big deal when it comes to kilayim? And we say no, mixing things together, fusing things together, bringing them together, not only it won't be harmonious, but it's going to lead to the opposite. Why do we say that? So we can understand this based on an explanation from the Tzemach Tzedek. The Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek explains that there's an inherent difference between the spiritual realm and the material realm. When it comes to fusing chesed and gevura, there's an inherent difference. In the spiritual realm, ultimately, everything that's there in the spiritual world, so to speak, since they are spiritual matter, they are all batel. They have bittul, total subservience to Hashem, and everyone has, meaning each aspect, each attribute, even though they seem differently, but they have this one and most important fundamental thing in common, and that is to fulfill Hashem's will. That is to carry out what Hashem wants to be carried out. In other words, to meet that objective. And since that is ultimately what governs them, and that is the core of their existence, therefore, even though on the surface they may be different, but ultimately their subservience to Hashem, their bittul to Hashem, and the bittul to the will of Hashem is instrumental, that when they come together in harmony and complement each other, help each other. As we said before, that the same person can have ava and yira simultaneously, and there's no contradiction. However, when it comes to the gashmiistic realm, when it comes to material things, worldly matters, over there, what is really the essence? How do you describe everything in creation, every matter in this world? Hashem created everything that it should have its own, so to speak, individual existence. It should have a separate identity of its entity, and therefore there cannot be a fusion, because each thing stands alone and is not necessarily capable, especially when they seem to be opposite, to come together, to fuse together and work in harmony. And therefore, begashmius, if it's not in a matter of kedusha, of holiness and service of Hashem, either you have ava or you have yira. You can't have both. And according to this, we'll understand the difference. We'll appreciate the difference between the various types of kilayim, whether the animals / agriculture versus the kilayim of garments. You see, when you mix two things together, two opposite things together, it can have one of the following two effects. There's two scenarios that can play out. One, that they become totally batel. They lose their unique identity. They lose appearance, and they just fuse together. Each one loses its own uniqueness, its own distinction. That is, quote unquote, a matter of peace. It becomes peaceful, it becomes together, but for that they have to lose their identity. Or the other option, the other scenario that can play out is that they both remain firm, standing, so to speak, firm in their own unique image, in their own unique identity. But what happens then when they come together? That is going to result in division, discord, because they can't get along. There's no way they can get along. They didn't become one. So now you have two separate things that are clashing with one another. These two differing manners in what can happen when two things come together, two opposites come together, or two varying things come together, they get expressed into two types of kilayim. When it comes to the animals or agricultural kilayim, over there, what is the purpose? What is the objective by bringing two seeds together? What is the objective by mating two animals together? Which is to actually create a new species, to take these two, and they, so to speak, both dissolve and become a new entity. They become something new. And in other words, from two normal species, you break it away and you create another weird and distinct new species, which is obviously against Hashem's desire. It's against the way Hashem set the protocol of creation, but they both dissolve and become something new. Whereas when it comes to the garments, what happens? They don't dissolve. Both species, that's wool and linen, remain intact. They remain in their actual own self, so to speak. And therefore, since they do not dissolve, what's going to happen if they are combined together and each one represents a totally different expression, a totally different aspect of things? Therefore, the only thing it can lead to is conflict and discord. And according to all this, we'll appreciate now all the three kinds, which is the two types of kilayim and basar b'chalav. When it comes to, and why this is permitted when it comes to a mitzvah or a matter of Beis HaMikdash, a service to Beis HaMikdash, and that is when it comes to garments, since inherently kedusha, anything to do with kedusha, anything to do with mitzvah, is inherently governed by the idea of shalom, of peace, of harmony, of unity, because it's the realm of kedusha, it's the realm of Hashem. Therefore, we don't have to worry about, there's no reason to suspect that there's going to be a lack of harmony, that there's going to be discord, because even though typically when you bring two opposites together, it's going to create discord, but in this case, what governs them and overrides any of that concern is the fact that this has to do with kedusha. So the problem is solved. However, when it comes to kilayim of animals or / agriculture, over there the problem is that you're destroying, you're voiding the inherent uniqueness of each of these species. In other words, you're destroying, you're going against the normal order of creation, the normal order of the Seder HaBriah. And therefore, even if it pertains to a matter of mitzvah, or kedusha of holiness, or the Beis HaMikdash, this isn't proper. Why? Because even in the spiritual realm, we're not allowed to, we're not meant to destroy the normal order of things as Hashem intended it to be. And therefore it's prohibited. But when it comes to basar v'chalav, when you have this type of mixture, this type of fusion of two opposites, over there, at least there was this initial thinking, there was this idea that maybe it is similar to kilayim of the garment, of material. And therefore, it should be allowed. It should be permissible in kachim, because it's just merely a matter of bringing two opposites together, but you're not destroying the inherent distinction between the two. However, the conclusion is based on the pasuk that says, "Beis Hashem Elokecha lo yisavashu gdi b'chalev imoi," that even there you're not allowed to, because ultimately the Torah compares it and holds it like the kilayim of animals and agriculture. To conclude, the Rabbeinu Bachai says, in regards to basar v'chalav, that when Mashiach comes, the prohibition of basar v'chalav will be batel, it'll be voided, and it'll be allowed. And what is the explanation on this, especially based on what we explained above? The fact that basar v'chalav becomes one entity, meaning after you cook it, or by cooking it, it gets fused together and becomes one entity, this is only in the material aspect of it. This is only in the gashmius, in the physical material aspect of it. And therefore, since the mitzvahs that we have now, we have to deal with the reality as we see it, as we experience it in this world. Therefore, since it appears to have been fused together, it's forbidden. But really, spiritually speaking, we didn't destroy their existence. We did not fuse them together. They didn't really mix together. And therefore, there's this idea, this thought, right? That's why we had that thought that maybe it's similar to the kilayim of garments. But what happens when Mashiach comes? When Mashiach comes, as it says in the Navi, V'ro kol basar yachtav kipi Hashem diber, that we'll actually be able to see with our eyes of flesh. We're able to see in everything the spiritual aspect of it, the word of Hashem that's in there, the ruchnius that's there. We'll see the truth that's in everything. And therefore, what will be experienced then when Mashiach comes? The truth that even when you take basar b'chala physically and you fuse it together, but spiritually you did not destroy their dual existences, you did not actually break it down and bring it together. Therefore, it's going to be permitted then, because indeed that is going to be the true reality then that we're going to experience at the time after Mashiach comes.